Welcome to Ink Mirror. Today we analyze the major aspects of modern period. This is an overview of British modern period. The modern period, beginning around the turn of the 20th century, has its roots in the late Victorian transition from widespread belief in art as a vehicle for pleasure and instruction towards a belief, at least on the part of artists, in art for art's sake. Poetry. The early 20th century, between about 1900 and the First World War, saw the beginning of radical new experiments in poetry. Early writers were especially concerned to delineate clear images and to rid poetry of its romantic and Victorian era superfluities, its emotion, its didacticism, its exposition. Many modernist poets look to 17th century metaphysical poets for technical inspiration. So the modernists were not entirely anti-tradition, and many, like T.S. Eliot, argued that modern poets must have an extensive knowledge of tradition. The metaphysical poets, of whom John Donne was the best example, worked with simile and analogy to present the reader with startling new comparisons. T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock contains a good example in its opening lines. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. The comparison of the evening to an etherized patient is both surprising, a comparison we have likely never heard before, but it also reflects the perspective of the poet speaker. That is, we learn about him by how he views the world. T.S. Eliot was also important in the way that his work presented allusions to and direct quotations from many other works, as though a new kind of poetry could in fact be built from fragments of the old. Modernism was not just a literary phenomenon. It took hold in many art forms and flourished both in England and continental Europe. Many writers, in fact, borrowed ideas from music and the visual arts. Many poets of the late 1930s and 1940s, especially post-Second World War, embraced a more direct, impassioned, and human tone, perhaps responding to the inhumanity of the war. But with the 1950s came a movement back towards the linguistic precision of the early modernists, that is, away from the emotive extravagance of the 1940s. While returning to a more precise language, however, poets of the mid-century, calling themselves the movement, were not so concerned to return to a style heavy with allusion and intellectualism. They were just as concerned to produce a poetry that was well crafted and concise, but that communicated the details of everyday life. Over the last half of the 20th century and continuing today, the English poetic landscape became more and more diverse. This is thanks in part to the diverse English voices that are now part of the literary tradition, but that emerged from colonial and post-colonial experiences in India, Africa, and the Caribbean, for example. Writers from these mixed heritages are especially well equipped to speak to the modern sense that many people feel regardless of their heritage in a world that often seems a mixture of positive and negative and the product of a fractured past. Poets like Saint Lucian speak directly to a divided sensibility, a love for an English literary tradition, but a deep scorn for a history of imperial mistreatment. This mixedness is becoming more obviously a benefit and not a problem of impurity, as for so long it was deemed to be by cultures who sought to protect a pure racial identity by denigrating anything that was different. Fiction. Despite its diversity, modern novels typically focus on themes like the individual in society and the temporality of human existence. Modernist novels tend to fall into three obvious spirits. 1900 to 1920s, a time of experimentation, elusiveness and complexity. 1930s, 1940s and 1950s, a time when novelists returned to social realism. And post-1960s, a period when important writers emerged from post-colonial contexts. In its early stages, the modernist novel turned inward to contemplate the workings of the individual mind, of characters and authors themselves. This marked a reaction to the Victorian concern for exploring vast social landscapes in the novel. Later, modernist novelists were no less experimental necessarily, though they often returned the issues of politics and class to fiction that early modernists had not examined so closely. Contemporary English fiction, if it is possible to distill any common tendencies from its diversity, often looks backwards uneasily to England's earlier days. Much contemporary fiction thus looks to provide a sense of perspective, as though the culture itself is now working through what its own history has meant, for good and for ill. Drama. Modernist English drama was not as obviously marked by the experimentation that characterized either modernist English poetry and fiction or that characterized continental European drama, which was much more concerned to break with convention and reinvent tradition. Modernist drama on the continent became increasingly self-conscious or aware of itself as drama. Non-English dramatists often broke with long-standing dramatic conventions, that is, that actors break character and or address the audience. Similarly, these dramatists challenged conventional notions of storytelling, such as that a plot should begin, reach a climax, and achieve resolution. Thank you for watching this video.